Hello, this is Philip Williams with another episode of Noah's Ark and Scripture Science. Now, my last episode, which many of you were excited about, it was concerned Noah's Ark. This episode, which I think you may find equally excited, concerns the flood that floated that ark to the top of this mountain. Now, I want to mention a famous statement about what would happen if Noah's Ark was ever found. This is Gilbert Hovey Gossenor, who happened to be the founding editor of the National Geographic magazine. And the National Geographic magazine, to their credit, they regularly covered possible sightings of Noah's Ark, including the one that I visited, which was one of the most popular stories they ever covered. But one of the ark searchers had asked Grosvenor about the possibility of the discovery of the ark, and Grosvenor may have been somewhat skeptical, but he knew what the consequences of it was. He replied, he said, if Noah's Ark is ever found, it would be the greatest archaeological discovery in human history. Uh, it's hard to argue about that, I think. But he also said, he said it would be the greatest event since the resurrection of Christ. It would really change the world. And if you ponder on that, you might understand why Grosvenor would make such a statement of that. But the last thing he said, which will be the focus of what I'll be discussing today, it would alter all the currents of scientific thought. Basically, Grosvenor was saying our science is wrong if there really was a Noah's Ark, because we don't even believe in the flood now. Uh, but and and in fact, he's right. This is the title of the day's episode, which is contrary to not only mainstream geology but also young Earth creationist science. The evidence of the worldwide flood of Noah lies on or near the surface of the earth. Here you see pictures on the left of some rocks laying on the surface of the earth that can't be very well explained by normal geological processes. And of course, there is a pre-flood home that was actually covered by the deposits of the flood. Of course, it's not taught that way now, but I'll explain how it's absolutely certain that was covered by the flood. Now, this, of course, points to the subtitle of my book on understanding the recent discovery of the ark, was how the evidence of the flood was reimagined as a long ice age. And of course, an ice age concerns recent deposits. Now, this book I published back in 2011, which got me started on this. I was looking for it. Is there any archaeological evidence of the flood? And I discovered there certainly are. These prehistoric remains was sites. I show you how these are definitely flood burials and not religious burials. Of course, archaeology is close to the surface of the earth. Now, but the other thing that I'll be focusing on in this episode concerns the fact that current geology cannot explain the geological deposits lying near the surface of the earth. So they essentially neglect them. This is a picture of some grading being done here. It looks like the red clay here in North Carolina where I live. And geologists really can't explain why. They can't explain how this red clay got deposited like it's currently deposited. But when they do understand how these deposits, it will explain them so well. It will revolutionize geological science. Now, this evidence that I'm talking about is not the evidence of the flood as taught by the younger creationists. Here you see different schools of creationism, and they all have similar teachings about the flood, but they're not the flood I'm talking about. I've already covered the fact that they have misunderstood the geological evidence of the flood. It doesn't. The main thing, it doesn't conform to the biblical explanation of flood, which talks about land animals and birds and human beings, the flood killing them, but nothing about creatures that lived in the sea that should have been able to escape even a tidal wave because they could swim. Uh, but nonetheless, most of the flood victims in the creationist model are fish, more than 95% of them. And but yet they cannot identify the people and animals that the Lord sent to the account of the Bible. How they they teach that the that the flood just entirely destroyed the Earth's surface and formed the fossils and fossil fuels. But and in fact, if it was that kind of flood, the ark, which is a pretty sturdy device that I visited, but it could not handle that type of destruction. But it could very well handle the kind of flood that actually took place. Now, aside from fish, the other victims of the of the creationist flood are extinct species like dinosaurs, but they're not very much like the Earth's current animals, land animals. I'm talking about, not the fish. Now, I want to return to the episode when Dr. Norman Geisler and I appeared on Fox News to talk about the Ark. Uh, we about less than a year later, Dr. Geisler asked if I would like to go with him to visit his friend Ken Ham, who had just completed this ark up in Kentucky. Some of you may have visited. It's a very nice ark, and Ken Ham shared with me how he built this. I'm impressed with the fact that it did have the bow. It's built not like a barge like some of the teachings are, but it does have a bow in it, and the ship that I visited had a bow in it. But a statement that Dr. Geisler made when the first words he said when we arrived is, "Ken, Philip and I believe the Ice Age was the flood." And of course, that's the subtitle of my book. And it was Dr. Geisler who encouraged me to complete this research. Dr. Geisler was himself a student of paleontology, and he knew some of the things that I'm going to be talking to you today. He had some acquaintance with that. Now, if you know Ken Ham, and he talks about millions of years and the problems that creates to the account of the Bible and the way that the creationists understand the flood. Now, here is what's called the geological column. This is the standard way that the layers of rocks appear in the earth. This was actually a younger creationist depiction of this, and you can see the millions of years on the side that are taught. But the creationists believe that that all these deposits, even though they believe that these are laid down in this fashion, but from the time fossils first appeared in the Cambridge, which is down at the bottom, to up until just before the Ice Age, which is the Pleistocene period on the top, all these were laid down by the flood. There are some other creationists who have an alternative. They believe only the period from about 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were supposed to disappear. That are the flood deposits. So there are some disagreement among the schools of creationist science about what the flood was. But what I'm going to be showing you today is how the actual flood deposits are here in what's called the Ice Age deposits, the Pleistocene, and they lie, as you can see, near the surface of the Earth. Now, this requires understanding geology. You see here, it looked like maybe Grand Canyon, and you see those layers that were depicted in that geological column. And then, of course, here's a park ranger teaching students the how to understand rocks. Here's a map of the United States showing some of these layers, because of erosions, they actually appear near the surface of the earth. And this picture shows where the different layers actually can be seen near the surface. And of course, geology also includes what's inside the earth, how the earth is formed on the inside. That's a very important subject when it comes to understanding, well, where did the water for the flood come from? But all this is geology, uh, and a lot of the creationists are really interested in geology, but it can be in fact, it is a very complex subject. But I'm going to try to make it simple so you can understand not only the true understanding of how the earth was formed, but you'll also understand. Be teaching mainstream geology and also creationist geology in the same way. And the way you do this is you go back and understand, how did this science come about? How was it developed? And then only if you do that, understand why it's being taught, then you can judge the validity of it. So we're going to go back to the beginnings of geology. Now, this man here, called James Hutton, is commonly hailed as the founder of geological science. There's this place in Scotland where he saw all these layers. There's horizontal layers and vertical layers. And he said, oh, it would just take countless time for this to be created. And he explained the earth as like a machine. He was friends of James Watt, who invented the steam engine. So in his view, the entire earth functioned like a giant engine, laying down these layers, and then they're somehow being fused and pushed up from below. And and in fact, Hutton is your popular geologist will say, yeah, he was the founder of our science. But the true founders of the science of geological science were the progressive creationists. And they're the ones that created this geological column. Or the first one I mentioned here is Jean de Luc, the Swiss geologist who lived in the Alps, and he went to England and became the reader for Queen Charlotte, who my city is named after. Her husband, of course, is King George III, who we won our independence against George III. But that'll give you some view of when this occurred. Now, Jean de Luc, he's really responsible for the old Earth. You've heard of old Earth creationists, the world being much older than man. Well, Jean de Luc was the first one. Now, Hutton, even though he believed that the Earth could be, infinite, but he believed that he had no way of showing that there was any evidence of the Earth's development. So, but Jean de Luc, by identifying these men here, the other one just below is Georges Cuvier, who was the head of the famous geologist at the French Museum, and he is the inventor of paleontology. You know, how you take a little bone and understand just from a single bone what kind of animal it was, what it looked like, and that's very important when you try to understand things like dinosaurs. Uh, and he was definitely in his day, he was the most famous scientist of his world, and a lot of science was developed from geology. So these men were very important. Here is Adam Sedgwick. He was he taught at Cambridge University, and he is the one that discovered the Cambrian, what we now know as the Cambrian explosion, the first appearance of life in this column of rock. And then at Oxford University there was this William Buckland, and at the time these men were working, geology was not respected in the university. It was things that amateurs did and all kind of people argued about. But Buckland said, no, we can find evidence of that support the Bible, and to show how important geology was, he would wear his academic uh, gowns when he would go into the field to study geology. Now, why you don't hear about them is because these men also actually made the discovery of the true evidence of the flood. They call it the diluvian flood. These were deposits found near the surface of the earth that I'm going to be talking about. Uh, and in fact, it was so influential that the oldest scientific journal in America, the American Journal of the Arts and Sciences, was established on diluvian geology. Now, diluvium, okay, that's flood geology, but it's not the kind of flood geology that you're more familiar with. These deposits that they found near the surface of Earth, the name of it, they call it diluvian. You know, the diluvium refers to the flood. Um, that was the only way they could explain this. You know, that was would be some kind of flood had to be responsible. They contained the bones of extinct animals, land animals, and you could see how that that would fit. You know, that would the flood would explain how these worldwide flood would explain how these animals suddenly went extinct, how these deposits were made. They weren't. They were trying to be empirical. They weren't trying to prove the Bible. You know, they were just strictly trying to go on the geological evidence. So, and they weren't sure that whether it covered all the Earth's mountains. In fact, they didn't necessarily believe in the ark, even if they believed in the flood. They believed that this whatever caused these were responsible for the flood traditions that in various nations, and also the account in the Bible. But they tried to come up with a natural reasons how this flood happened, whether it was a great tidal wave coming in from the ocean and just you know, because like some of the tidal waves I'd heard about, or the more popular one is they believe that the continents and the oceans would exchange places, and this but it would do this in a sudden revolution. Like that term revolution has a lot to do with this teaching about this flood. The French Revolution is happening about the same time. Now, there are human remains and artifacts that were found in these diluvial remains, but they did not believe, especially because Cuvier said there were no human fossils. It became and the way they explained this, well, at the time of the flood, mankind had not spread out beyond the lens of the Bible, so that's why there were no human remains in here. But now let's go to the actual evidence. We'll start. Here's a geological historian referring to these. He referred to it a chaotic assemblage of sediments ranging from muds, silts, and sands. You see them in the picture here, and gravels, which frequently had contorted structures, to extremely poorly sorted deposits we now refer to as till, with pebbles and boulders or rocks embedded in a fine-grained matrix. A simple bedding in such deposits was frequently impossible to discern. It looked like all these were sort of dumped there, like in a flood, but it had to be a really great flood because there were so many deposits, and yet there are no regular layers of these floods happening. Now, some more evidence is the fact that they had the bones of extinct animals. Among those are the woolly mammoth and woolly rhinoceros and saber-toothed cats. You see these artists drawing these in the Ice Age. They would later conclude that these were deposits from an Ice Age, but at this time there was no thought of an Ice Age. It's just these animals were roaming, and they suddenly disappeared. and it included these frozen animals up in Siberia that Cuvier said the only way that these animals would not have instantly, been preserved, they had to be suddenly frozen, is if it was a flood that caught them and then and froze them at that time. Then, of course, there was also North America. This is the time when the Europeans came here, there were no horses or camels, but there was in ancient time. There are bones of these extinct camels and extinct horses. And so you can see a sudden extinction of the animals, that the flood explained not only these various deposits, but the sudden extinction of these animals. Now, some more evidence was this, what's called less. This is this rich black soil in the American Midwest and in China and other places, and it seemed to be laid down through marine deposits. So there was evidence of it, but there's not enough. It's like it was dumped there, and so that was more evidence of the flood. Then there were these rivers of the wide U-shaped valleys, deposits. The rivers could not really explain these wide valleys because the V-shaped banks, the rivers are cutting these narrow channels, but they couldn't explain how the wide valleys and the deposits in these wide valleys. So that it could be explained that these rivers appeared after a wide flood really sculpted these wide valleys. Now, the last evidence, diluvian evidence I'm going to mention are these rocks that you saw in the picture earlier. They're called erratics because they're found. Where they're found is not where they originate from, the bedrock where they originate, which may be tens or maybe even hundreds of miles away. How do you explain these rocks getting where they presently are? There's no geological process, not even present floods that could explain this. So the only way they could explain these erratic rocks was some type of water at a greater speed than what does not presently exist. So that became the evidence of the diluvian flood. Now, as I mentioned, this diluvian flood will be later explained as an ice age. That was hard to believe that there was a frozen flood that does it. Still hard to believe. Here's the picture of how the ice age. The glaciers are supposed to have come down North America all the way down to New York City. Now, when the explorers began finding these glacier sheets in Greenland, and very shortly after that in Antarctica, it became easier to believe that at one time these ice sheets came down further. But as you can see, they don't come down to, say, where I live in North Carolina. So there's already a problem. But these erratic rocks definitely exist here, and I point these out to geologists, and they're very perplexed. And of course, that's not the only reason. Well, I'll be covering in future in future episodes the topics of, first of all, what was the process of reimagine the diluvium I've been talking about that these founders of geological science discovered? How did that come to be reimagined as glacier deposits from the Ice Age? Of course, I'll also be explaining why it's impossible that glaciers could be responsible for these deposits. But that's currently being taught. And the significance of this now is that it pushed back the antiquity of man, because if instead of 1 year flood and you're seeing the remains of the antediluvian world, if you push back this time zone to hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of years, it pushes back the appearance of man, because there's human remains and artifacts in these in these deposits. Now, this was completely independent of Darwin's theory of evolution, but the conclusion about this what's called the antiquity of man, was made in the same year, 1859, as Darwin's theory of evolution, and it would be very important for for believing in the evolution of man. If man first appeared, say 6,000 or maybe 10,000 years ago, there was there would be no possibility of evolution. I'm also going to be talking about how the scientific dating, which we have now, um, it's not as objective as you think. Even though I use radiocarbon dating, and I believe, but but the dating, which is supposed to be objective, and I'll be explaining why it's not so objective. It will always follow the narrative, and therefore it's always pushing back the remains of early man and the first this and first of that. It's pushing things back. It just complicates and muddles the scientific understanding of early man, which we're going to really show that it's actually quite simple when you see what's really happening. And I'll also be talking about how science operates, why it's difficult. Unless you get the big picture, which I'm going to be doing, you really can't challenge it. Now, I really have no problem with mainstream science, because I use their paradigms. I have a new paradigm to explain their evidence, but I also want to explain how secular science, and for that matter, even creation science, it functions very similar to sectarian theology. And if you know something about some of the quarrels among various issues, how people can be divided, they don't want to try to come together. I'm going to be making the I'm going to hope that the creationists, my creationist friends, whether they believe in the young Earth or old Earth, or a local flood or worldwide flood, we can all come together and criticize what I'm presenting here and do science as it really ought to be. And that would really revolutionize science and scholarship. And it would, of course, lead to Gosnoor's prediction that this would be the greatest event since the resurrection of Christ. So thank you for this. Listen to this this podcast on Noah's flood. Thank you.